Thank you so much, Bolaon, for your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right, so Bolaon, please go ahead and tell us, because critics have actually argued these measures are protectionist and damaging to global economic stability. And you've heard what our previous guests have actually had to say about this particular discussion. So how do you assess the immediate and long-term impact of these tariffs, on the global trading system?
Well, the immediate impact is panic and uncertainties. And we have seen how that is playing out on the markets globally, everywhere from Nigeria to Japan to Europe, everywhere across the world. When there is uncertainty, markets don't like it. So you see all the red everywhere. So in the immediate, there will be that sense of panic. Of course, in the medium term, maybe subsequent to that panic, there's likely to be certain negotiations. So some people are likely to sit down with the American government to say, okay, this is it, that is it, and let's be able to reach a middle ground where we can both be comfortable. So that will also happen after this initial panic. But in the long run, especially if I narrow this to Africa, or even particularly to say Nigeria, there will be an adjustment. And if like Africa, for example, is not particularly that much significant to global trade. The entire global trade, the entire slice of Africa in global trade is just about 3%. In fact, if you're using the U.S. Trade Organization data, is about 2% of the entire global trade. So it's not particularly significant. However, on a global scale, this is very serious. The cost of consumption, the cost of product, the cost of services are going to increase globally. The disposable income, the purchasing power of people will reduce globally. And there is tendency for there to be inflationary pressure across most economies. So it looks to me like a lose-lose situation. I don't see a winner here in a trade tariff regime, and that includes the United States itself. The question is, if everybody else gets poorer, how do you think you are going to get richer? It doesn't work, because you need all these people you're making poorer to actually make you richer. So if they all get poorer, you are likely to end up being poorer as well. So to me, it's something that we have to wait out. We already know how this has played out in the past. This is not the first time there has been an attempt at all this kind of tariff, and we know how it played out in the previous situations. Maybe this is going to be different. Maybe Trump is setting a record about something that has never been done before. We will have to wait out that part. But for all the economies, we need to start making necessary adjustment right now, including Africa and Nigeria, in spite of the tiniest slice of global trade that we hold.
All right, now, thank you so much for that, Bolao. Now, I'm being told that Professor Andrew Nevin, research professor, Center for Brain Health, University of Texas at Dallas. He's also a former partner and chief economist, PwC Nigeria, has actually joined us. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor Nevin. All right, so we'd love to hear your thoughts on what is going on around the world as regards the tariffs as well, especially how it affects Nigeria and Africa at large, because experts have actually said that these tariffs will most significantly impact African economies reliant on U.S. trade.
Well, let me start out by saying really no one knows where this is headed, right? I mean, but if we go back in history a little bit, for 40 years, Donald Trump has been talking about the importance of tariffs, has made the point that tariffs are a beautiful word in the English language, they're the most beautiful word. And it's not a big surprise. He said on the campaign trail, President Trump, that he would be imposing these tariffs. So he's in fact done exactly what he said. I mean, if the conditions that we see today persist, of course, it means an unbundling of the entire global trading system that we've had over the last 50 or 60 years, and probably the architecture of the economic architecture we've had since the Second World War, the IMF and the World Bank and the system of relationships. So that may be the end game. I think that what people need to understand is that President Trump has been very clear that he puts America's interests first. And his perception is that the trading system and the world financial system has been very detrimental to the United States. So he's imposed these tariffs. And even in the time that we got up since this morning here in the United States, he's now threatened to, people who are following this closely may know that China has a tariff rate of 34% that was imposed by President Trump. This morning or over the weekend, China said that it would impose 34% tariff on American goods. And just this morning, the President Trump has said if that's not rescinded, he'll raise another 50%. So every indication that the United States is clearly unraveling the global trading system, painful, as other commentators have said today on your show, painful for everyone involved. I'm Canadian, particularly painful for Canadians because the integration of the auto industry since the 1960s on that. But I think in the context of Africa, I mean, one of the things I said when I still lived in Nigeria was it was important for Nigeria to have good economic relations with everyone, including with the African nations under AFCFTA. But it needs good economic relations with India, with China, with Europe, with the Middle East, and with the United States to the extent possible. But you know, anyone who's too dependent on one export market, on one country, is going to be disappointed, and particularly if that market's the United States. So I think that advice still stands. The United States is less than 25% of the global economy. The other 75% certainly continue to cooperate if the United States wants to essentially drop out of the system and find many opportunities for value addition. And let me just close these remarks by saying that, of course, the other thing going on is that the only young people in the world are Africans. I mean, Africans are essentially getting to be close to 50% of the world's young people. I mean, we need Africans to do the work in the world. So regardless of the tariff system here today, the long-term economic direction of travel is for Africa to become more and more prominent and for Africans to play a massive role in the global economy.
Okay. Now, Gbolahan, you heard what Professor Nevin has actually said. He talked about, you know, Africans rising up to do most of the work, and we know that these tariffs, you know, might effectively override AGOA privileges. So with 32 African countries eligible for the program, how do you foresee these nations navigating the loss of preferential trade terms?
Well, it looks to me as if AGOA is dead as it was. But then it doesn't mean we cannot begin to make certain amends that will still make us to be able to even have a relationship with the U.S. As far as some of these trades are concerned. Like I said, it's a small part. For example, when you take in Nigeria, where the non-oil export to America is barely 250 million naira per annum. That is not particularly big. So the question that we must be looking at a micro level is to say, look, can we identify what these items are that we produce and we export to, say, America? Once we are able to do that analysis, that identification, then we can decide on how we're going to be able to, I think there's a freeze on the network.
No,
so we can then decide.
We can still hear you, Gbolahan. Please go ahead.
In a more competitive basis.
Please go ahead, Gbolahan. If you can hear me, we can hear you.
Okay. Oh, I can hear. Okay, I can hear you now. Okay. Yeah. So if we take those items that we produce and export, and let's say it has been 100 naira for a unit before, and because of the additional 14% tariff, we need to walk back and see how can we produce these items at less than the cost we have been producing them, essentially becoming more competitive at producing that same item. If we do that, even after the 14% tariff has been slammed, we will still be competitive in an American market. So the consumer, the ultimate consumer in the American market, will see that in spite of the 14% tariff, the net price that he has to cough out has not increased any significantly. Maybe the effect is 1% or even 0%. That will sustain that trade, and there is possibility that we can even grow it as far as the particular product we have identified is concerned. But then beyond that, Africa must trade more with Africa. We have African oil producers, and most Africans who need oil go outside to get the oil. We have African refiners now. There's a huge refiner in Nigeria, which is produced with a huge capacity. The question is, how many African countries that are importing fuel are importing from these African refiners? So the Africans must learn to trade more amongst ourselves. It will help not only in terms of the immediate problem with the Trump tariff, but even on the long run for the continent itself.
Okay. Now let's hear from Professor Nevin. Now, looking at the World Trade Organization's rules, is there a possibility that the affected countries, especially African countries that were affected, could successfully challenge the U.S. tariffs? And what precedent might this set, for future trade disputes if we do?
Well, I think the difficult word is in what you said was successfully. I mean, I don't think the United States has any interest in necessarily following what any multilateral organization dictates at this stage. I mean, they've been very clear they're not part of the International Court of Justice in The Hague, for example. And there's some doubt in the United States about the relationship between the judiciary, the executive branch, and Congress right now, and the ability or the willingness the willingness of the executive branch to follow judges' orders in the United States. So I think that a WTO challenge has really limited value. You might be ruled in favor of by WTO rules, but that's not going to affect the United States. And I think that Bolahan said exactly, what we need to think about, which is how do Africans trade more with Africans. But the other piece of this that I think is very interesting is there hasn't been much conversation, and of course the tariffs don't apply to services. And in the global economy, services are bigger than goods. In the traded economy, not quite there, but we have huge trade in services. And of course, before I left Nigeria, PwC was really, I think, the leading voice talking about the need for Nigeria to export services, including to the United States. And as far as I can tell, those don't have any tariffs or any additional tariffs on them. So I think that strategy, which His Excellency the Vice President has laid out very well, is still one to continue. And of course, in the Nigerian context, we all understand the infrastructure problems, the cost problems. So we always argued when I was still in Nigeria, before I left in 2023, that it's more economic for Nigeria to export services. And with the imposition of tariffs on goods, that argument becomes even stronger. So I would like to see Nigeria really think about doubling down on the export service-oriented strategy, the high-value export-oriented. Of course, it's not just the United States. These services are exported to Canada, to the United Kingdom, to Japan, to Europe as well, and South Africa on that. So I think that strategy remains viable, as I said, even more viable. And I think, as I said, Bolahan is exactly right. We need to have more trade of both goods and services within Africa.
All right, so Bolahan, you seem to have something to add to what Professor Nevin has said.
No, I'm actually just going to firmly affirm what he has said about services. The beauty about Africa having a young population is the mental and physical energies of the youth. How do we deploy this? And one of the places where we can deploy these energies is in provision of services. IT services, for example. Can we expand what we are currently doing in the IT space? Can we think about other services that we can offer? There are no tariffs on services. So it's something we really need to think about because of the constraints that we have about competitiveness when it comes to production of goods.
Okay. Now, Bola, still on you. Now, in response to these economic shocks, reports have it that some nations are considering fiscal policy tweaks. Now, what measures, like tax breaks or even increased subsidies could best cushion the blow for affected industries? And you did say a bit about, the IT industry.
I'm not so sure I got I got that question clearly. You're asking of what policies can governments, implement
Yes, what
to
measures?
cushion the effect of this.
Yeah.
Well, part of it is what has just been mentioned about services. So we now need to look at what can we do in the services space to improve on our capacity to export services. We were in this country some years ago when Mr. Zuckerberg showed up at Sabo in Lagos. He didn't go to see the president or the governor, he came to the marketplace. So there must have been certain things about that marketplace that were of interest all the way from where he sits in America. How do we consolidate those kind of things? How do we put resources behind them to ensure that we can produce those things and export them? So policies along that line is very important as far as I'm concerned. Well, issues around subsidy to drive export, I would rather, I prefer a situation in which other measures other than subsidies are deployed for competitiveness. But in extreme situations, we've seen subsidy play out whether in China and US, especially in the agriculture space, and see how that could also be effectively deployed. But I am not a fan of subsidy. I believe it is something that is open to abuse, especially in our environment where the management of those subsidies may not be as effective as it is supposed to be, but rather exposed to abuses by players within the system.
Okay. Well, Professor Nevin, let's quickly have your final thoughts on all of this.
Well, I think, the American policy is very clear, which is put America first, make America great again. And people need to understand that's the agenda that President Trump is executing. But all of us in every country in the world, including Canada, where I'm from, including Nigeria, where I lived the longest as an adult, I mean, we have agency as well, and we need to make the decisions that make the most sense. And I think it's very important to just think a little bit rationally about this and look out 5 or 10 years. Where do you want Nigeria and Africa to be to make those decisions? And they always say every cloud has a silver lining. These are tumultuous times. But as a Canadian, for example, it's really made us think about what it means to be Canadian, how we want to diversify our economy across different countries, our security arrangements. We being very dependent as Canadians on the United States, and we're having a rethink about that. And I think ultimately that will lead to a good place. I think in the context of Nigeria and Africa, it's the same thing. Again, the United States has played this outsized role in the world, and now it's said it's not going to play that role, and it's not going to be a benevolent leader in the world. So that gives a chance for Nigeria to really think what's its place in the world. And we've talked, Bolahan's talked a lot about the relationship with Africa. I've talked about relationship with India. We wrote a paper talking about how critical that was. The world is a big place, and I just think that Nigeria needs to take this opportunity to think through how it fits in overall with that. And, let's accept where we're going with the United States in this new world.
All right. Well, thank you so much, gentlemen, for your time and for speaking to us on this topic. Professor Andrew Nevin, Research Professor, Center for Brain Health, University of Texas, and former partner and chief economist at PricewaterhouseCoopers, Nigeria, based in Texas, USA now. And also Bolan Olojede, financial and development expert in Lagos, Nigeria. We appreciate you for your time. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us on The Conversation. All right, so let me begin with you, Nnamdi. First of all, we'd love to hear your thoughts on this whole imposition of trade tariffs across the globe, because at first, what we thought started with the US and China trade war has actually gone wild. It has impacted a lot of countries at the moment. So let's hear your thoughts.
Thank you very much for having me. I think the best way that I can characterize the implications of Trump tariffs is in the sense of, is in 3 categories. One is the bad, the ugly, and the good. The bad is that Trump tariffs is creating an environment and a context of more conflagration in the world. We already have geopolitical tensions in Europe, in the Middle East, and then these tariffs are really unleashing another dimension of socio-political global the problems and potentially a disaster if you're a developing country. So that's the bad. There's more global tension in both commerce and geopolitics. The ugly is that African governments, including our Nigerian government, are woefully and shamefully unprepared and unresponsive to what is potentially one of the most important economic and geopolitical times in our history. And so it confirms once again that African governments really are the respite of political gangsters and their foreign handlers and have no vision for our people. The good news is that I believe this is going to force civil society entities to take the mandate or to take the mantle from African governments to say that we also have a voice and we also have a power in this process. And we cannot let a handful of individuals who call themselves politicians or part of the economic elite lead us into annihilation. And what I mean by annihilation is that if you look at the fundamentals, not only of Nigeria, it's economic fundamentals of Nigeria and as well as other countries across Africa. By mid-century, we're talking about within the next 25 years, we are going to be looking at unprecedented economic and physical slavery that we've never seen before. So the current times are very dangerous, very threatening, and we must show much more leadership and awareness in terms of addressing them both economically and politically.
Now, still on you, right? Still, since we're talking about Nigeria now, how do you, assess the impact of the 14% tariff on the Nigerian exports and its effect on the $10 billion annual U.S.-Nigeria trade? Briefly.
Right. It's interesting because if you look at what Nigeria exports to the U.S. and really globally, the majority of it is crude oil. So in a sense, it doesn't necessarily affect current trade, so to speak. Now, the wider context is that Nigeria has missed the boat. And by that, what I mean is that the current commercial global world order was built such that developing countries will produce goods very cheaply, paying their own people slave labor wages. And then more developed countries would consume and would move up to higher skilled, higher rung jobs and wages. Countries like China and places like Taiwan and South Korea took advantage of this arrangement over the last 40 to 50 years and have done exceptionally well. Why did they do well? Because they realized the benefits from technology transfer, they invested in their human capital, invested in skilled labor, and they were then able to leverage the skills and the capacity they built into other sectors and became the thriving economic hubs that we see today. Unfortunately, Nigeria, including many other African countries, didn't take advantage of that ladder, so to speak, didn't create an enabling business environment. And so we are in a position where we've already missed the boat, and then the future also looks very precarious for us. And this is a time that we need strong, vocal, articulate, and specific leadership in order to create a vision and a plan for us to move forward. Otherwise, the prognosis for us is horrendous.
Okay. Now, let's hear your thoughts, Bamidele, on all of this, and also how you think that it would influence investor confidence and also cause the Eurobond yields to surge, particularly for key sectors like the oil and agricultural sector.
Okay, first of all, you quote a number that I'm wondering where that data is coming from. Nigerian trade, are you looking at export of Nigeria to the US when you call 10 billion, or you're looking at the export of Nigeria to US and US export to Nigeria? Because I'm not sure it's more than $6-7 billion. However, when I saw this news, my first response was Nigeria is about to lose about 10% of its export market, because Nigerian export is about 60 billion thereabout, and about 6 billion is export to US out of the total export of Nigeria. And like the other presenter mentioned, majority, about 90% of Nigerian export to US is crude oil and gas. Now, but on a second look deeper into the data, I realized that if Nigeria gets some things right, particularly in terms of infrastructure, particularly in terms of production, particularly in terms of support for the real sector, manufacturing, we might just be able to take advantage of what is going on in the US right now, considering the fact that Nigeria is among the few countries that have the lower tariff rate. In Africa, you have Ghana 10%, you have Egypt 10%, you have Morocco 10%, Nigeria is 14%, But the major supply in Asia, like China, China is about 34%, Vietnam 46%, even Japan is 24%. So I foresee a situation where countries that are producing, and maybe we'll get to those conversations, I mean, kind of product I think Nigeria should be looking at, countries that are producing competing product with what these other countries have been producing. Now that they have to pay a high tariff, making their product more expensive in the US market, if we are able to meet up with the quality requirement and produce efficiently, we probably will be able to take advantage of those markets. My thought on the situation.
Oh, okay. Now, Nnamdi, you heard what Bamidele said. He said we might just be able to take advantage of what's going on. And one of the things that's going on well for Nigeria has to be initiatives like AGOA. Now, in your view, do you think that these tariff policies undermine the developmental goals of these initiatives like the AGOA, which have bolstered economic growth for decades?
So I appreciate the optimism of my friend here in terms of Nigeria and other African countries potentially being able to fill a gap and manufacture goods at a lower cost and be competitive. But I don't see that happening because, quite frankly, we don't have the enabling environment to do that, not only from a policy standpoint, legal trade law standpoint, but also from an infrastructural standpoint. 90% of our population is really, according to the World Bank and IMF, et cetera, living in multi-dimensional poverty. In addition to that, we have not invested in the education of our people. So we have a situation where the average youth in Nigeria, maybe 70% of them, 80%, are not fit for a 21st century economy. How are we going to compete based on that? The unfortunate truth that nobody tells our people, and nobody has been telling us for the last 40 years, is that we have missed a significant economic and geopolitical boat. Because while we should have been working and investing and being concrete in terms of our policies, we had politicians and so-called leaders who have been effectively selling out our birthright. So that optimism in terms of that we can fill a role is not going to come to bear. We don't have the capacity to do it. Now, as far as AGOA is concerned, so AGOA is a two-pronged issue as I see it. AGOA was intended to be that ladder that we in Africa could use the same way that Southeast Asian countries use in order to rise in the economic ladder, so to speak. But we haven't taken that ladder, and it's too late. One of the problems that we have in our political and economic discourse in Africa is this concept that one day will be okay, or that we have time. We've actually run out of time. We don't have time anymore in order to effectively improve without a drastic restructuring of our socio-economic environment. And that includes taking more power away from our African governments who do not have a vision for our people, and civil society entities actually filling that void. I do also want to add that AGOA, in a sense, was a neo-colonial tool, because one of the key tenets of AGOA is that you couldn't go against US policy, right? And so on one hand, it was intended to be a carrot and an enabler for African economic development. On the other hand, it was used as a straitjacket for Africans because we couldn't disagree or do anything outside of that construct. I do want to add that AGOA should be ending this year, and I wouldn't recommend that we go into it. I actually recommend that we follow the trend and go into a sort of economic protectionism and isolationism where we need a new game plan for Africa. We need a new game plan for Africa that is not based on export-driven production, that is based on insular production, insular planning, and self-reliance and self-independence. And that's what I believe the direction that we should be going into.
All right, now back to you, Bamidele. Nnamdi did say that he believes AGOA is a neo-colonial tool, and he doesn't believe that Nigeria has the enabling environment to take advantage of this situation. Now, considering our trade benefits under the AGOA, which are at risk, speak to us on what your thoughts are, and also what measures policymakers can take to mitigate some of the losses.
I mean, AGOA have never been successful, and the reason is simple. You are giving a child, a 1-year-old without teeth, a chicken lap to eat. How does he enjoy the value of that if he doesn't have a teeth? We really are not able to benefit from AGOA significantly because of a lot of challenge of export readiness within, not just Nigeria, most part of Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. And it's a tool for control. Like I said, it's a tool for control. Rwanda at some point stopped the movement, the import of used clothing from the US, and US yanked Rwanda from AGOA. And Rwanda is saying we want to become self-reliant, self-sufficient in producing our own clothes and shoes. But US said, no, you must import used clothes and shoes from the US. So it's a tool for control. I've never been in support of it. So I don't think we should even be talking about that right now. I think what Nigeria should be looking at right now, what are the low-hanging fruits? Currently, Nigeria exports crude oil to the US, top export of Nigeria to the US, crude oil, petrol gas, fertilizer, lead, cocoa and cocoa preparation, oily seed, plastics and plastic articles, edible fruits, and then fish and crustacean. Those are the major top items of export that constitute about $6-7 billion. Those are the conversation I think Nigeria should be having right now. What do we need to do to grow the production volume of this product? Because some of them we can actually do it and be able to take advantage of the market created as a result of this. Those are the conversations I think we should be having. I don't think we should be talking about AGOA. And like you said, AGOA is ending this year, and we've not really been able to benefit from it. And I don't see that happening right now.
All right, Bamidele is still on you. Let's digress a bit to some of the African countries, especially for those small, heavily indebted countries within Africa. Do you think that these tariffs could exacerbate existing debt crisis, within these countries?
I think so because one of the challenges we've had in Africa is the fact that we have not diversified our source of income, which I think this can do for some African countries, because for the tariff, some African countries also have a very high tariff. For example, you have, I think it was Madagascar that is 47%, even though Botswana is about 37%. But we have Morocco, Egypt, Ghana,
Lesotho
Nigeria,
is 50 as well.
Hello?
Lesotho is 50 as well.
Is that?
Lesotho is 50.
Yes, exactly. So because of this, meaning we won't be able to take advantage of this market because, the US is the largest importer in the world. So if you're not trading with the US, you're not likely going to be able to do as much as you should be doing, which is why you have the alliance of China. Of course, China is learning that the hard way right now, find other market for themselves. I think it's going to increase it because of even the ripple effect you are seeing as a result of this decision in the world it's not going to be a good one for African countries in general, particularly for those that won't be able to take advantage of this market and the fact that they've not even diversified their source of income before now.
Okay. Now, Nnamdi, speaking of Lesotho, they're facing tariffs as high as 50%. How do you foresee African nations collectively responding to these pressures? Because, questions have actually been raised on what, if the infliction of the pain comes from a coalition of countries and also governments banding together to strategically hit the U.S.
100%. I think that's a fantastic question. So first of all, African countries are not necessarily going to feel the pain of these tariffs from an export standpoint. They're going to feel the pain from an import standpoint. The reality is that most of our economies are import-driven, which is that we import as much as 70% of our goods. Nigeria is an excellent example of that. And so we are going to see, with these tariffs globally, the cost of products increase. And with the cost of products increase, that's going to put further pressure on lower and mid-income Nigerians and Africans in general. And so I foresee over the next 5 years that the current state of penury that we see in the country is going to be exacerbated tremendously. Because generally there is a spirit of isolationism and protectionism that's happening all over the globe. And so that's where the impact is going to come from. I mentioned that at the top of my introduction that the response of African leadership and African governments has been woeful. I think before we start talking about our economic response, we as Africans, especially in the civil society, have to take power back from African governments because they do not have a vision that empowers Africans, let alone puts Africa at in a place of global dominance. Because quite frankly, that's what we should be searching for. And so what does that mean? It means that there needs to be a significant restructuring of African countries and Africa as a whole in order for us to be able to survive in this century. And what does that mean in critical terms? It means that we have to start looking at aggregating certain powers at a continental level and then devolving certain powers at the country level and at the national level. And so what I mean by that specifically is this. Finally, this concept of a one Africa with one voice has to come to the fore. Doesn't mean that individual countries and individual nations and nationalities don't have their own powers, but there are certain things that we have to do collectively in order to have the economies of scale to be competitive at a global level. And some of those levers are monetary and fiscal policy. We have to come together on that and have a singular monetary and fiscal policy strategy. The other aspect is international diplomacy. We can't have 54 African countries, or as far as I'm concerned, 46 sub-Saharan Black African countries negotiating different ways. We have to come to one voice in order to have the weight. There also has to be a strategic agreement on governance. We can't have a developing continent when we have the madness that's happening in Sudan. We have the madness that's happening with Paul Kagame, Rwanda, and Democratic Republic of Congo. So there are some social political items that we have to get off the table first to then position ourselves to be economically strong. And out of all the various key stakeholders in African societies, in Nigerian society, it's the civil society that has to rise to that level in order to take that power. And the reason being, because at least in the civil society, we have pockets of people who have the necessary capacity, capability, and integrity to be able to execute strategy, not the political gangsters that we have in office today. So we have to be able to walk before we can run. And walking, first of all, means taking power back from African governments, and that is what we at ADAF and obviously civil society entities are working towards beginning this year.
Okay. Now, Bamidele, speaking of Africa economic response, just as Nnamdi has actually rightly said, we know that Zimbabwe has announced plans to suspend all tariffs on U.S. goods, after facing an 18% tariff from, this whole tariff issues. Now, what are your thoughts on the IMF's warnings that escalating trade tensions could trigger global inflation and even recession?
If we don't speak with one voice as Africa, because we're already disadvantaged economically. Total export of Africa is just about 2.5% of global trade. The economy is just about 1.3, 1.4 billion. So we are already at a disadvantage. Trying to do individual negotiation, for me, it's not a good way to go at all. And the whole idea of AFCFTA is for us to be able to come together and trade together, of course, but more importantly also is to move beyond just trading together to have not just free trade agreement, custom union, a common market, and probably similar monetary policy and single currency on the continent. Those are the conversations we need to be having. So that in this kind of situation, Africans speaking with one voice, which I believe is a very tall order because these guys have successfully divided us, and it doesn't look like the leadership right now are really, really ready to be able to do what they need to do. But if we are able to achieve that, then it will have been a lot easier for us to do one negotiation. Look at what happened in the case of EU. The whole of EU, 20%. The whole of EU, 20%. Which is, some will have been a lot higher, some will have been lower, if they were to deal with them one-on-one. In Africa now, we have people as much as 40, whether we have some people as low as 10, people will have been able to have an average tariff that will have helped the other countries within the African continent. Now, another issue I'm seeing, in addition to what you talk about, the inflation, of course, IMF because of the increase in cost of goods as well as the tariff, is the fact that we're likely going to also see some job losses in Africa because China is already positioning itself. Two things China is doing. They are supporting their exporter with export credit insurance to go to any other market to sell their goods, protecting them in case there are risks they will be facing in that market, and providing finance support to increase production to those markets. Meaning, since we are import dependent in Africa, for example, in developing country, they are going to find a way to get those goods into Africa, and they are going to come in at a cheaper rate, and we might see our factories being shut down because other products are coming in cheaper and they're able to price out our manufacturers. So beyond the cost of living, beyond the inflation, we might also be seeing a lot of job losses in Africa because of the option that these other countries need to begin to look for to sell those goods. Because those goods must be sold. The factory must keep working, else those presidents are going to have issue with their people, because they also are going to have a lot of issue with job loss if the factories begin to shut down in those countries.
All right. Now back to you, Nnamdi. Bamidele did talk about, Africans speaking with one voice. And from what we know, China and Canada have implemented their own countermeasures. The European Union, which is facing 20% tariffs, is preparing for countermeasures as well. Australia criticized the 10% tariff but opted against retaliation. Japan expressed strong disappointment and is considering responses through a dedicated task force as well. So the question is, why are so many governments not acting fast or even in unison? And also, what are the prospects for new trade alliances among African nations as a countermeasure to U.S. protectionism?
Yeah, I can't emphasize this point enough. African governments, and you can take, for instance, our Nigerian government, we don't have to look too far. Has there been any kind of speech or common communication with the people, or any kind of, even the imagination of a plan or a strategy to come out and say, this is how we're going to respond to this very monumental event that's happening? There hasn't been anything. There hasn't been anything really in Nigeria. Mr. Tinubu is nowhere to be found. It is missing in action. And if you look at across the continent, not a single African leader has come out to say, how are we going to respond to what is a seismic shift in economic affairs globally? Not a single one. And what does that tell you? It tells you that these people have no interest in that African governments are not the solution to what we're facing today. It tells you that the responsibility has to fall on us in civil society to come together to take and check power from African governments in order to develop a vision and a plan in order to move forward. What is that going to take? It's going to take organizing and coordination. And we at ADAF are in the process of joining, organizing, and coordinating with other civil society entities to create a continental plan, as well as a country-focused plan. So from a country-focused plan, one of the things that we're looking at is setting up a civilian Congress. A civilian Congress that will check the executive, the judicial, as well as the legislative branch. So do we have an environment that where at least things are working? Because once things are working, then we can begin to put together a plan for a much more robust response at an international level. But I want to make it clear again, we don't have the apparatus to be able to speak or strategize in this current environment. The apparatus of choice, which is African governments, have not been functional. Therefore, we in civil society must step into that void in order to get power back and then create a strategic response. That strategic response, I believe, will have to be based on four very important tenets. Number one is that we have to have a conversation around demilitarization, not only in Nigeria, but across the continent. There's no way that we can talk about economics and development without demilitarizing the continent, because that continues to cause issues. The second thing is that we have to look at, finally not even look at, but we have to now take the step of economic independence, which first of all starts with food security and food independence, because as it stands today, we're importing 70 to 80% of our foods. So I'm hoping that a combination of the geopolitical shocks that we've seen, or that we are seeing, as well as this economic shock, will cause Africans, not just African governments and so-called leaders, but Africans in general to say, let's take a deep breath and just stop. We have been running for 60 years like headless chickens since independence, running around, economy this, economy that, and we have to take a stock and say, stop. We have to be strategic, and we have to then be tactical in terms of creating a strategy that is going to lead us out of the economic and social quagmire that we're in today. So again, we have to be able to walk before we can run. We can't talk about being responsive on the international level where we don't even have running water, for goodness sake, in certain places in Lagos or even in Abuja. So we have to take power back from the existing government by creating a civilian Congress that's going to be a watchdog for our political apparatus. Then we can begin to strategize and put together a plan to be responsive at the continental level as well as the global level. If we don't do that, as I've said, we are looking at unprecedented economic collapse and economic failure in Africa within the next 15 to 20 years. It's not going to get better. The dislocation that we see today, the fact that there are families that only eat one meal a day, if that is not going to get better. Yeah. And we in civil society must take that power, organize and coordinate in order to make it happen. And that's what ADAF is about.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, gentlemen, for your time and for speaking to us on this very, very interesting topic.